everyone to our Ed Chat. I'm Heather Tooley, and I am very excited about my conversation with Richard Davidson from Marco. Richard, thanks for joining us. I know Marco has been having some really interesting conversations around learning environments lately. And honestly, some of these ideas challenge the traditional way people think about furniture.
Well, that's absolutely correct. And while it may sound strange coming from a furniture manufacturer, some of those conversations and realizations are the best talks and the best conversations are coming not actually discussing furniture, but more about students and teachers and what schools are ultimately trying to accomplish.
That's such an interesting statement coming from a manufacturer. So, what do you mean by that?
Well, if you think about it, before a teacher ever says a word, before a lesson's ever taught or students ever start opening a textbook, they're forming impressions about the room. The environment is communicating expectations the teacher may have. You know, if you have rows facing forward, it sends a message. If you've got a collaborative environment, it's sending another message. And spaces with choice communicate, still something different. And it's important to realize that the environment begins influencing the behavior well before instruction ever starts.
So, the environment itself actually becomes part of the learning experience.
Yeah, absolutely. The environment is certainly not neutral. It's going to influence how students move, it's how they interact, collaborate, even maybe even how comfortable they feel when they're participating. And I think sometimes we underestimate just how much the physical space can actually shape the learning experience.
So, what are some of the biggest shifts that you're seeing schools think about right now?
I think the biggest shift I see is that learning has become probably much more dynamic. During a day, a teacher could be moving from, say, direct instruction to small group activities to independent work, and maybe in the day with collaborative learning. And the classroom has to be able to support all those transitions. And schools are more often now asking us, how can the environment help teachers be more effective? And how can it help improve the impact on students and how they learn?
That actually feels like a pretty major mind shift.
I think it really is. For years, most of the conversations started with your product. Why should I buy from Marco? What do you make? What are your colors? What's your cost? And all of those things are certainly important, but the more schools we visited and the more educators we've listened to, the more we realize that those conversations are starting too late. The better conversation should be, what are you trying to accomplish? How are your students learning? What are you doing today that's working well? What's not? And once we started there, things started to change. The conversations became more meaningful. And ultimately, the solutions became more meaningful as well.
Mhm. Now, one thing I found really fascinating was your idea around the silent language of space. Can you talk a little bit about that?
When we talk about the silent language of space, it's because every environment is communicating something, whether we realize it or not. Back to the way it's arranged. If you've got rows and rows of desks, it's supporting more direct instruction. If you've got a circular environment, it's encouraging more discussion and participation. Rooms with mobile furniture, for example, make it easier to adapt throughout the day. So spaces that provide choice can help students feel more ownership over their learning experience. And while none of this guarantees a specific outcome, it absolutely influences behavior.
Yeah, for sure. And that's where the conversation around shape really came from.
Exactly. And one of the things that we became curious about was how that shape, how our shapes, for that matter, influence interaction. And as we learn more about learning environments, we started paying closer attention to the role shape plays in collaboration, in movement, and really overall engagement. So you think about a round table versus a rectangular table. That shape changes sight lines, it changes eye contact, it changes how people engage. And it's not that one shape is right or another shape is wrong, but different shapes support different objectives. The more we understood that, the more intentional we became about the products we develop and how our manufacturing process needs to be designed to support that.
So, how did this change Marco internally?
I think the biggest shift there, Heather, was moving from product questions to outcome questions. And that's our whole new approach to selling. As a former school board member, I've been exposed to the process of specs and bids and budgets and the questions that administrators and board members ask. But after years of visiting schools and spending time with educators, I realized the better question wasn't what furniture do you need? It's more of what are you trying to accomplish? And once we understood the objective, the furniture becomes part of a solution rather than the starting point of the discussion.
Well, how so? Talk to us a bit more about that.
Well, as a manufacturer, we're now spending more time listening. We want to understand what's already working in the classroom, what's not working, what are they ultimately trying to achieve. And what we found is that when you truly understand the objective, the challenges, the pain points, the solutions become clearer. Sometimes they want flexibility, sometimes it's more mobility, sometimes it's issues with durability, but sometimes it's not even furniture related at all at the end. But when you start understanding, you make better decisions and can provide better solutions.
And that thinking eventually evolved into the Marco 360 approach, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. When we realized that we're going to, if we're going to truly understand the school's needs, that we can't start with furniture. So we came up with a 360 approach, and it's the way we look to make sure we're looking at a complete picture. Who are the people we're talking about? How are they teaching? How are they learning? What does the physical environment look like today? What are you wanting it to look like? And why are you making this investment in the first place? And because the better we understand those things, the better the solutions evolve. And when those things align, the environment you create, it becomes more effective for the teacher and for the learner. And that's the ultimate goal we're trying to accomplish.
I love it. So you shared a story, a really great story from a district visit in Texas. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. Yeah. From time to time, I go on sales calls with the dealer reps and meet decision makers. And I was a band guy in high school and college, and this was going to be a band room discussion. So I tagged along and had the opportunity to introduce our band store products to the district. But instead of immediately talking about cabinets and specs, I spent a lot of time asking questions to better understand the challenges the district had, and what was working, what wasn't, validating what we were hearing in the industry about versus their experience, what were their pain points, and that led to a tour of a local school so we could see how the space was actually functioning, and all of that together kind of changed the conversation. Instead of guessing what they needed, we could actually see the challenges. We could talk through the solutions we had and point out in the classroom how that could impact that. And we were able to align the solutions we had with the outcomes they were trying to achieve. And what I expected was going to be a 30-minute conversation turned out to be a 4-hour working session. And not because we're talking about more products, but because we were developing a true understanding of the problem. And once you understand that, it's easier to find the solution and get the buy-in from the other side on that solution. So, you need to listen, observe, and understand the challenges, and then you need to move what I call from being just another source to truly being a resource for the end user.
Hmm. That's such a huge difference.
I think huge is the right word there. Schools have plenty of sources. What they're looking for are true partners and resources who are willing to invest the time up front to understand what they're truly trying to accomplish. The best solutions come from that, not just the guy that opens his coat and says, what do you want to buy from me? You need to take time to listen, observe, understand the challenges to make better recommendations. Sometimes that leads to a completely different product. Sometimes it leads to a different classroom layout. Sometimes you back up and have a completely different approach, but at the end of the day, it's always best uh, to understand the actual need rather than make assumptions.
So true. You also talk about the concept of reading the room differently now. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, as a furniture guy, when I walk into any room, I still notice the furniture, and that's just After 30 years of doing it, it's a hard habit to break. But what's changed is how I look at that. What I think about, the questions I ask in my head and out loud. It's, how does the space feel when you walk in? How does the furniture kind of fit? Does it encourage the goal, whether that's maybe collaboration? Does it support flexibility to transition? Those are all things that make sense before I can even present a solution or a way to improve. And I got to look beyond the products themselves to understand the experience that the classroom is ultimately trying to create. And every room's communicating something, whether you realize it or not. And as I continue to learn and my team continues to learn, we're getting better at identifying what works, what doesn't, and where there may be opportunities for improvement. Sometimes those suggestions don't even involve Marco products. Sometimes they do, but they reflect an evolving understanding, I guess I'd say, of how environments impact learning and impact the overall experience for both students and educators. And that's really what being a resource is all about.
So, Richard, where do you think learning environments are headed?
I think the future is less about furniture specifically and more about how flexible it can be and will be in the future. As we continue to learn about student outcomes and the factors that influence learning, we have to build that learning into our products and our designs. And the challenge is that education is constantly evolving. The science behind learning is continuing to be understood. Teaching methods, they evolve, technology evolves, student needs evolve. And while we can't predict exactly what furniture is going to look like, we can be confident that it will change. I think back to the desk chair combos that were in the classrooms when I was in school in the 70s and the 80s, and every classroom was rows and columns, and that served a purpose, but didn't offer much flexibility. Now you fast forward to today, our classrooms need to support a much wider range of learning activities and teaching styles. So I think the future is about creating environments that can adapt more easily as needs change. And then you got to throw on top of that, you can recognize schools can't just completely reinvent or replace all their classroom furniture every 5 or 10 years. Budgets don't allow for that. So what they can do though is build on what's working. So refresh proven concepts, introduce new ideas where they make sense, but create a flexibility that allows spaces to evolve rather than starting over. And having products that are flexible will allow them to be repurposed and not just simply replaced. And that's, I think, where the biggest opportunities are.
So, what do these opportunities mean for manufacturers?
Well, I think manufacturers have to keep learning too, just like everyone else. We shouldn't pretend to be educators. That's not our role. But we have to continue to be learners about the environments and the methods that are used to educate kids. We can listen, we can observe, we can ask better questions, we can continue learning from educators and researchers and designers and students for that matter. And the more we learn, the more valuable of a resource we will become. Ultimately, our job isn't just to make products, it's to help make sure those products create environments that support learning, support teaching, and support the ideas and philosophies that work to make educational spaces better.
I love it. So, last question for you, Richard. If there's one thing that you hope listeners take away from this conversation, what would it be?
I think it's every environment is shaping something. The question is whether we're being intentional about what we're shaping. The more we learn, the more we understand, the more we can know where the district wants to go, the better the decisions will be that we make. And when we take the time to understand that before we recommend, we can move from being a source to a better resource. And because learning environments should do more than simply hold students, they should help students connect, help students engage, collaborate, think creatively, ultimately grow in their learning. And that all starts with understanding. And because when the environment's right, that's where learning takes shape.
This has been a really great conversation, and it's just wonderful to learn more about your work and what you and your team are doing together. So, a big thank you, Richard, for chatting with us today. And as always, thanks to everyone for listening in. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to share with your colleagues who also care about the future of learning environments just like we do. And definitely visit madebymarco.net, where learning takes shape every day. Thanks again, Richard.
Thank you, Heather.